Good morning, everybody. Good to see you. Welcome to the Waterview Church of Christ. I'm coming to you live from my dining room. I guess for the time being, this is our new normal. Hey, Jennifer Shear. Hey, Jeremy Thomason. Glad to see people are starting to watch. See the Huddlesons watching. Jim and Travis. This is kind of our new normal. This is the second time, I guess, that I've come to you through Facebook Live, or perhaps you might be watching this on YouTube at a later time. At any rate, we're glad that you've tuned in and you're paying attention and you're doing your very best to weather these difficult, trying times. We know that this is not something we're necessarily used to. I don't know if we will ever get used to it, but the idea of the church being the church away from the church building in a lot of ways has probably been something that we're not only adjusting to, but we're learning some things about. We're learning that we can be the people of God, even though we are separated from each other. We're isolated from each other, at least temporarily during these times. Obviously, it's easier when we can go about our normal business, but we're trying to use these times, a time of growth, a time of solitude, maybe a time of pause and reflection, as I want to talk about a little bit this morning, to grow closer to God. Seeing a lot of people tuning in there. Michael Howell. Good to see people. I'm going to just wait a minute or two, let as many people as possible try to get online here. Jeff Jarrett, Pamela Patterson. Morning, Akins. Good to see you guys. The Neighbors family. Linda Little. Glad to see you. Hi, Kaylee Brown. Good to see you. I don't know what you're using as your time of reference. I guess I'm going to use the time of reference 2 weeks ago today as when this started. That's when we didn't meet for our very first time. And so now here we are 2 Sundays from then. And of course we came to you last week with a sermon, and this is our plan for the future, is to keep on communicating with you online, such as we are. Our ministry staff, we're in regular communication with one another, and we're doing our very best to try to stay engaged with you. We want to thank our shepherds for the work that they're doing. Even though we can't see each other face to face, I know that they are mindful and they're overseeing the church and they're wanting to shepherd you. And the ministry staff, we're doing our very best as well to put out content that we think will be helpful and beneficial to you. And so we're just trying to get used to this. Again, I don't know if we will get used to it, but we're doing our very, very best. Good to see Kristen Dye watching, Sheila Withrow. Hey, Mike Norwood. Going to get started here in just a moment. I hope you'll turn to the book of Psalms. We're going to spend our time this morning in Psalms. And if you want to go ahead and look at Psalm chapter 3, we're going to read that passage together here in just a few moments. I mentioned a moment ago, I don't know what your time of reference for measuring these events might be, but it was 3 weeks ago that everything seemed to change. 3 weeks ago, 3 Sundays ago, that everything seemed to change. It almost seems like an eternity since we were able to come together and worship as we normally do. And in those short 3 weeks, so much really has changed. Words like coronavirus or COVID-19 or social distancing or shelter in place, all of those new terms to us, they've become all too common, unfortunately. And I know that this has affected each and every one of us in some way or another, some, of course, worse than others. But we would all agree that coronavirus has, in a sense, turned our lives upside down. So this past week, I began to map out a preaching plan for us to follow for the foreseeable future. Since this is what we're going to probably have to do for a few more weeks, I wanted to map out a plan. And the thing that I started to think about is how the Psalms bring something to us that I believe all of us really, really need at a time like this, and that is serenity. And so starting today, and again for the next few weeks, I want us to focus on a theme from the book of Psalms that I'm calling Serenity from the Psalms. I hope that'll be a source of encouragement and peace and help to you during these very, very uncertain times. So wanted to kind of zero in on a sermon series. And then the second thing I thought about this week is, where do we begin with this? And, the Psalms are not written in chronological order necessarily. They have divisions and they have different types of themes, things that they cover, different perspectives because it involves different people. We normally associate the Psalms with David, but he didn't, of course, write all of them. And so I started to think about what person maybe could speak to us from their story that would help us during these uncertain times. And it might not be a surprise to you that I thought King David, he's the one that I think we need to pay attention to, we need to listen to. And of course, he is one who wrote so many of these Psalms. In terms of prestige and power, probably the only person alive today that could relate to David's life might be somebody like a United States president or another world leader, because they're at the center of attention. They carry out power. The very stroke of their pen or a spoken word or even an inference is so very, very powerful. And when you think about how David's life might relate to one of our presidents, I thought about how you might compare what happened to President Nixon. Those of you that are old enough to remember that incident, what happened to President Nixon is maybe somewhat comparable, not a perfect comparison, but at least comparable to what happened to David when his son Absalom drove him from Jerusalem. Both of these presidents, both of these leaders, they had power, they had prestige, they had protection that was associated with the highest office of the land. But then both were very quickly removed from their office. And in what seemed like an overnight development for David, he went from monarch to meanderer, from ruler to roamer, from feeling like he was the highest, and he was in the land, from feeling the highest to probably feeling like he was the lowest. Now, if you want a historical record of this, 2 Samuel chapter 15 through chapter 18 tells us the story of how Absalom, the Bible says, stole the hearts of the people of Israel. And in a matter of no time, it seems, David was forced to abandon Jerusalem, weeping, walking barefoot, with his head covered, even with some of his enemies jeering at him. And it wasn't long after that. At one point, David found himself camped one night beside the Jordan River, and he was waiting an assault from his son Absalom's army. And that assault could obviously not only end David's life, but it could end the kingdom of Israel. And this probably felt like the last chapter to David of a terrible series of events, because if you know some of the history, what had gone on before, Tamar was raped by Ammon, and then Ammon murdered Absalom, and then Absalom was exiled by David, and then David was exiled by Absalom. And that's where we find ourselves now at this point in the story. And as I said, 2 Samuel tells us the historical record. You might say this is the history of the kingdom at this time, but it's Psalm 3 that tells us the heart of a king, the heart of King David during this moment in his life. And I want us to really take the time to look at Psalm chapter 3 this morning, because I believe it shows us what we need to do when your life turns upside down. And I know that's how a lot of us feel right now. What do we do when our life turns upside down? And there are three particular parts to this psalm that I want to observe with you this morning in the next few minutes. But what I thought we'd do for just a moment, if you have a Bible, if you're looking at a device there, in Psalm chapter 3. Let's just read the account of Psalm chapter 3. Beginning in verse 1, O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising up against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. For you strike all my enemies on the cheek, and you break the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessings be on your people. That's Psalm chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. Now, as we look at this psalm, let's see what we can learn. Let's see what serenity we can take from this psalm when, like David, it seems like our life is turning upside down. First thing I want you to note with me, it's pretty obvious, I think, as you look at this psalm, is David had a serious problem. There in verses 1 and 2, you can start to understand a little bit more about this psalm, or rather about this problem. As I said before, you can read in 2 Samuel, beginning in chapter 15, about these events, but I think these first couple of verses in Psalm 3, it kind of brings David's problem into focus. And something I want to note with you, before we even consider these verses, there's something else to consider here that is so interesting, I think, about the book of Psalms, and particularly about this psalm, something that is, I guess you would say, new to the Psalms, because it's not there in Psalm 1, it's not there in Psalm 2, but in Psalm chapter 3, there is actually a title to this psalm. And perhaps if you're looking at your Bible, you might read before verse 1, the title, A Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. Now what's interesting about this particular title is, according to the theologian James Montgomery Boyce, these titles in the book of Psalms are actually part of the canon. They're actually in the Hebrew text. And he says that they are to be taken with absolute seriousness throughout. And I think that's interesting to observe, because what this title is even saying to us is this is what was going on in David's life. I think the psalm, as it's introduced in this way, when it says this is a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son, is trying to get us to focus in on David's problem, especially the heart of the king as he is dealing with this problem. So it's helping us to know what David is thinking about during this time. So therefore, when you look at this problem, as you see here in verses 1 and 2, you can see some excruciating aspects of this problem. A couple things to note. Number one, how this must have looked to David. He addresses that there in verse 1. Every day, the problem that David was dealing with seemed to be getting worse. Does that sound familiar to you? It sounds a lot like what you probably hear if you turn on the news right now. There's nothing about the news right now that's encouraging. And every time you listen to it, it sounds like they're just saying this is getting worse. And maybe it is. And that's the way David felt about his situation. He felt like everything was getting worse. The problem looked like every day it was getting worse and worse. The reason he felt that way is because it seemed like his foes were increasing. And that's really what he's talking about here. He said, how many are my foes? Every time he looked at the problem, it looked like he could find another enemy. He could find another person that had turned against him. I mean, to begin with, his own flesh and blood. His son Absalom had turned against him. He's out running for his life because Absalom had run him out of Jerusalem. And then many of his former friends and associates, many of the people who had been faithful to him, they now turned against him, according to 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 13. So not only is this issue, this problem he's dealing with, not only would he have seen this is how it looked, but more importantly, I think these verses say to us how it felt. how it felt. Our feelings are powerful and they're strong. And at this point, how this problem felt to David must have been so difficult. These enemies were impugning his relationship with God. He says, many are saying of my soul. It's like they were saying things that were hitting him in the heart. There was one who was loyal to Saul's family that was saying that David was getting what he deserved. You can see that in 2 Samuel 16, 7 and 8. And there was some truth to that, obviously. You know the statement, the sword shall not depart from your house. There were consequences to what David had done. These events, of course, are coming after the events of David, Bathsheba, murdering Uriah. And so there's some truth to this. David was reaping some of the consequences for his actions. But even beyond that, I think these enemies were signaling that David didn't have a relationship with the Lord. Perhaps they were even saying that the forgiveness that God had given to David was not real, that maybe David misunderstood that. Now it's being evident that God was still against him. And the accusation here is that God is against him. As it says, there is no hope, there's no salvation, there's no deliverance for him and God. That's what his enemies were saying. And so can you just imagine how that must have felt to David? A man after God's own heart, a man that had this intimate relationship with God. And he's hearing from all sides, people near and people far. He's hearing there's no help for him in the Lord. In our darkest times, this is kind of what our enemies do. They suggest that God's not there. They might say, he's not for us. He's against us. They may even make us feel that our forgiveness that we believe is a promise from God is not real or it's not possible. And so the weight on David's soul during this time must have been massive. Concerning this awful moment in his life, Charles Spurgeon said this: if all the trials which come from heaven, all the temptations which ascend from hell, and all the crosses which arise from the earth could be mixed and pressed together, they would not make a trial so terrible as what's contained in this verse, in this passage that we're reading. Spurgeon said, it is the most bitter pill of all afflictions to be led to fear that there is no help for us in God. I think that's how David felt. This problem that he was dealing with was so massive. And what the people were saying, it was starting to get to him. That's pretty obvious in this psalm. David had a serious problem. But then the next thing I want you to see is how he used this problem to turn his attention to God. And this is what I want us to take from this morning. Here's the serenity we get from this psalm. When we see someone dealing with problems, when we see a man of God dealing with problems, notice what he does. He turns his attention to God. And so the next thing you see in this psalm is what I would call David's prayer. And it's most of this psalm. It's the middle part of this psalm, especially verses 3 through 6. I'd like to note a common characteristic of the Psalms, though, with you before we even talk about verses 3 through 6, and that is this expression, seli, is I think how it would be pronounced in the Hebrew tongue. We would probably pronounce it as Selah. And you see this very often in the book of Psalms. You see it at the end of verse 2, for instance. What does that expression mean? Well, the idea in the Hebrew for this word, which occurs about 74 times all throughout the Old Testament, is it means a pause. It's a pause. Many people think that it speaks of a reflective pause, a pause to meditate on the words that have just been spoken. It may have also been a musical instruction for a musical interlude of some kind. There's a lot opinion about what this word means, but most everybody says that it means some kind of pause, a reflective pause. Think about that for just a moment. Considering that Psalm 46 verse 10 reminds us, be still and know that I am God. Considering that fact, I think there's something significant about the transition you're seeing here from David's problem to David's prayerful proclamation here. Like David, when we face problems, we need to take a spiritual pause. We need to be still, and we need to remember that God is still God. And so I think that's something valuable to see in this transition from David's problem to his prayer, is there is this pause in the text. This is in the text. So in a sense, we need to do the same thing. When we're facing problems, we need to pause, have this reflective pause, and we need to remember. And perhaps that reflective pause sends us into a prayerful proclamation like David in this case. In a sense, this prayer really begins in verse 1. I said this is mainly in verses 3 through 6, but it really begins in verse 1 when David cries out to Jehovah God, to Yahweh. This was the personal covenant term for God among his people. Yahweh has the same connotation as in the New Testament for believers who would cry out, Abba Father. Same connotation. Yahweh was this personal, it was a proper name for God, but it was also a personal covenant term for God among his people. If you had a relationship with God, you could call him Yahweh, Jehovah God. And so that prayer begins there in verse 1. But then in verse 4, I want to come back to verse 3 here in just a moment. But in verse 4, David, it says, cried aloud in prayer. And the text says, and he answered me. And then verse 5 seems to confirm the historical account that we read about in 2 Samuel, where David and his men were camped at the Jordan River one night. That night must have been extremely stressful. But I'd like to remind you that David navigated this problem with prayer. His prayer allowed him to sleep. He said, I laid down and slept. Now, have you ever had a problem going to bed at night and it kept you awake? Probably. David showed us what to do here. He shows us how to handle that. He went to his God. He cried out to his God in prayer. And when he did so, David said, I lay down and slept. You might say that prayer is like a soft pillow. His prayer also allowed him to be sustained. He said, the Lord sustained me. And then his prayer also allowed him to be sure. He was sure, according to verse 6, that God was stronger than many thousands. You know, long before Paul said it, David knew it. What Romans 8 verse 31 says, if God is for us, who can be against us? So you've got David's problem. You see how he pauses and turns his attention to God in prayer. And the third valuable lesson I want you to see here in Psalm chapter 3 is David's protection. I want to go back to verse 3, and if you're looking there at your Bible, you probably recognize these words. The first part of verse 3, it's a beautiful song that we sometimes sing. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, and the lifter of my head. When David was in greatest need, he didn't need a sword, he needed a shield. The word sword was, the sword I should say, as far as a soldier was concerned, was for assault. But remember, a shield was for protection. And then this term, you're the lifter of my head. Beautiful phrase. It sounds a little awkward, a little strange maybe to those who don't know what it means. But this was a beautiful Hebrew expression. And it was the one for restoring someone who had been cast down. For instance, in Genesis chapter 40 and verse 13, Joseph told the cupbearer, Pharaoh will lift up your head and he will restore you to your office. This is the idea of restoring someone who had been cast down. And David said, Lord, that's what you're going to do for me. In this protection you're giving me, you're the shield, you're the lifter of my head. You're going to restore me. It's a powerful proclamation of his faith, really. Verse 7, if you're looking at verse 7, I think it's an example of what we would call an imprecatory request, where David not only asked for salvation, but he also asked for God to punish his enemies. And that seems a little odd, a little strange to us, but the Psalms are filled with imprecatory psalms. You've read this probably more than once about how the prayer is not just for salvation, but for God to destroy those who are trying to hurt the redeemed. And so David not only asked for salvation, but he asked for God to punish his enemies. He says, strike all my enemies on the cheek. He said, break the teeth of the wicked. What this expression says is it speaks to the total domination and the defeat of the enemy. David looked for protection from this psalm, but he also looked for more than that. He looked for victory, and it was going to take God doing this for him to have that total victory. And then finally, if you look down in verse 8, David acknowledges his confidence is solely in the Lord. The confidence that David had was not in himself. It was not in his army. It was not in his mighty men, but it was in the Lord. He said, salvation belongs to the Lord. And you can also see the answer to his prayer was not just for David, but it was for the people as well. David didn't want personal victory. He wanted kingdom victory because he was on board with God's plan. I want to read this to you. I think it's a good summation of this story as we conclude this morning. David turned this horrible experience of betrayal, emotional pain, and nearly being killed into a psalm of praise. This teaches us that God can use our worst trials to deepen our trust in him and to produce praise that will encourage his people. When life seems to be turning upside down on you, I want to recommend that you experience the peace of God. You lay hold of him in believing prayer when you have problems. And then know that he, in answering that prayer, he will do the right thing. He'll answer. That prayer should be according to his will, not ours. But if it's his will, he will protect us. And then when he protects us, we give him the glory. We get the joy, and God's people will get the blessing. Some of that is from the pen of Stephen Cole. I want to give you 3 challenges as we end today's lesson. And perhaps you might want to put some of these down in the comments as if you're still watching. 3 challenges. Number 1, as you reflect on these days, these unprecedented times that we're living in, I want to challenge you to spend some time in spiritual pause and remember God is Jehovah and he's in control. Spend some time in spiritual pause and remember that God is your God. He's Yahweh. He's your covenant God. He cares about you, and he's in control. I want to encourage you to redeem some of this downtime, to redeem some of this social isolation, and maybe not watch as much TV or stay on the internet as much, but spend some time in reflection, in some spiritual pause, and remember who God is. Because this is a problem we're all dealing with, and that problem should cause us to pause and remember who God is. Secondly, let that spiritual pause allow you to spend some extra time in prayer. Pray more. Go to God, our all-powerful God, and ask him to intervene. I guess the prayer that I've prayed the most is that God would just take control of this, that he would work in his ways, this mysterious way, it might even seem to us, of allowing this problem, this pandemic, this creating havoc in the whole world, allowing it to stop just about as fast as it seemed to start. See, God can do things like that. And He's our God. He's in control. So I've been praying that prayer. I've been praying for you. I've been praying for my family. I've been praying for doctors and nurses. Praying for people in general. But try to spend some extra time in prayer during these days, asking God to intervene. But pray what's on your heart. Have a relationship with Him and spend some extra time in prayer. And then here's the third challenge. Realizing God's covenant concern and protection. I want to challenge you to explore how God may be using this time right now in your life to make you more like He wants you to be. See, one of the beauties of this passage in Psalm chapter 3 is this problem calls David to reflect. It calls him to turn his attention to God. And I'm convinced if the Bible teaches us anything, it teaches us that God can take problems and He can turn them into a way for us to have progress. And so I want to challenge you to explore how God is using this time in your life to make you more like the child of God that He really wants you to be. If you want to share some of these thoughts in the comment section, I'd welcome you to do that. Just to summarize this challenge, pause, pray, and then make some progress. Use this problem to grow in your relationship to God. Thank you so much for tuning in, being involved in this online sermon. We pray, we hope that your family will continue in a time of worship, that you will sing some songs together. If you have the opportunity to take communion together, for you to pray, for you to perhaps read some more scripture. Remember, as we've been reminded, that the church's work continues to go on, and when you have the opportunity to support the congregation financially, all of those things would be appreciated. Thanks again for tuning in. We love you. We appreciate you. And let's, again, use this time that's filled with difficulty to draw closer to God. Hope you have a great day. I look forward to seeing you back here next Sunday. We love you.